Alice, where are you, Alice? Alice, where are
Hello.
you?
I'm from Rochester, New York.
Wow. Such a contingent from Rochester. That's
Right.
nice.
Israel, Rochester,
Nathan, of course, and Mike Tova. We are working feverishly on your Haggadah. You can't imagine. I hardly sleep at night trying to get it straight. And Jean, it was so good seeing you on Shabbat. And wow, I see Ronnie's on. Whoa. And who else is on? Robert, that's a Hasidic yarmulke, Robert.
Yeah, you think so?
I got to get you a Srugi.
This is true.
And Bird.
Very
Oh my
true.
God, Glenn Richter. I'm in silence. What am I to say? Here is, I'll give you Glenn Richter's talk on spiritual activism. Avi, we're traveling somewhere. Did you bring a can opener? Did you bring a can opener? How otherwise we can't open the tuna cans? Or in other words, salami. Did you bring the salami? Because salami doesn't. Apparently, it can hold itself for a while. Or Glenn's great line was, he only wanted to protest with our back up against the wall. How am I doing, Glenn? Glenn, say a word to everyone.
Is he there?
I see his name. Maybe he fell asleep.
Yeah.
Glenn. I dedicate one of my books to Glenn, the one on Soviet Jewry.
I should hope so.
Glenn is the tzaddik. All seriousness, people. Glenn for me is just, in all my days, I've just never met anyone.
Rabbi.
Glenn said he has no computer camera.
Yeah,
No.
so he can't come on, but he hears
That's
you.
it. He's so humble. He doesn't want to be seen. This is Glenn. Drives me nuts. Glenn, my Glenn. Yeah, I remember one time we were protesting in Italy, and Italy or somewhere, I forget where it was, Austria, and we were busted, and I think the cops took us onto the plane. And the story I remember was that when we got on the plane, one of the hostesses remembered or was very supportive of what we did, which was on the news, and said, well, we got 2 seats in first class or something like that. And Glenn, you stood at attention. You said, on principle, I will not sit in first class. That's my Glenn. No one like Glenn. No one. Unbelievable. And I know Janet is on, Adrian's on, Janet's on, Shayna Leah, the Lone Ranger.
22 people.
Judy's on, I'm sure. Laser, are you on?
I am.
Laser, okay. You know what I would say that we just did? It reminds me of my days in the base medrash. We used to learn, the start to learn is with a chavusa. But the first 20 minutes, we just, it's called we battled. Do you know what battled means? We put up with each other. And anyway, it's such an honor to have all of you on. Okay, we're going to get down to business, but I want to start with a nigun. Our topic today is about Tu B'Shvat and trees. And when I was a little kid, my father used to, I'm not sure if he wrote the music, but he used to sing to us little ditties like, I wish I had an aviron to fly across the sea, to fly to Eretz Yisrael, and there to plant a tree. That's what he would sing. And Tu B'Shvat was last Thursday, and it is, according to the Mishnah, it is one opinion, the New Year's of trees. The other opinion is it's on Rosh Chodesh Shvat. But the common acceptance that it's the 15th of Shvat, and it's also a day which is known as the tipping point of the winter. When we look at the winter months, once you hit Shvat, means we've turned the corner, you Miamians and Boca Ratonians. We're going to catch up. It's going to get a little warmer in time. And the tree of life has become an important symbol, of course, in Judaism. The tree of life is one of the trees from the Garden of Eden. It's maybe the secret, the hope of ultimate redemption. And as my Lance, Dr. Lance, my professor, always on target, always. As Lance said, there's a lot of discussion about how the menorah in the temple, some people like Hirsch, Samson Raphael Hirsch, compares it to a tree. And there's really much more in the Sfirot, in the mystical Sfirot. In English, the Sfirot are the emanations. And God is really a complex picture. God is, of course, beyond the picture. But the Sfirot, God being made up of attributes of chesed and rachamim and all of that, there are some who see it as a tree. And as a matter of fact, it's famously used by Joseph Albo in his book, the Sefer HaIkarim, the Principles of Faith. When he lays out the principle of faith, he sees it as a tree. And I'd like to begin with a little bit of a nigun that I wrote when the Tree of Life Synagogue was attacked. You remember, it goes back now, hard to believe. I think that occurred in 2018, I'm not sure, but it's a while ago, and there were Jews who were murdered. Really a horrible, horrible moment. And so I wrote this nigun and some of the English words, and whereas the first half talks about Pittsburgh, the second half is actually to the words Eitz Chaim Hi. It was dedicated to the synagogue known as a Tree of Life, and the message was the tree of life is yet to live, will one day be. And so, Shuli, if you have that, let's put that up. It lasts about 4 minutes, something like that. And then we're going to dive right into the relationship between trees and Tu B'Shvat and spiritual activism.
קצת מן האור דוחף הרבה עיר החושך a little bit of light pushes away
hard to believe such a tragedy. And that was followed soon after by San Diego and Muncie, New York, and Jersey City. And the reason I wanted to begin with that Nigun is because that was the Tree of Life synagogue. And as an expression of spiritual activism, there were thousands upon thousands of people who flew and drove and walked to the Tree of Life synagogue to offer solidarity. That's one of the major principles of spiritual activism, and that is show up, be present, no questions asked. And when you arrive, one has to know when to back off. But most of the time, people so welcome when people do show up. And so the book that I wrote, it goes back now 25 years, on spiritual activism, its cover in the first edition was a tree. I don't know if Shuli has that to show everyone, but it was a tree because in the spirit of Joseph Albo, I saw the need to present the theory of spiritual activism. Notice, it's not just activism, it's spiritual activism, which I thought was my original term. But now with Google, I see it's not. It's such an obvious term that many others discovered it, and I didn't check, but I'm sure they discovered it before I thought I came up with it. Most things that we discover that are good have been said by others, and the others should receive the credit. And in the preface of the book, I write the following. Perhaps I think Shuli has made this available. This is what I write in the preface. Spiritual activism can be viewed as a tree with three different elements: root, trunk, and branches. Root, trunk, and branches. That's on page X1X. It's in the preface, so it's before the numbers kick in. These elements correspond to the foundations, pillars, and principles of spiritual activism. The imagery originates with the language of the liturgy, which describes the Torah as a tree of life, as Torah's most central imperative is to choose life. Spiritual activism also allows life to flourish. Moreover, as a tree grows, it yields shade, food, and other benefits. So too with spiritual activism. As it evolves, it protects, nourishes, and helps humankind reach greater heights. And so we begin by talking about the foundations, the ikarim. And the foundations we compare to the roots. The roots of spiritual activism is the foundations. What is spiritual activism all about? And there, in the first section of the book, which talks about the foundations of spiritual activism, like the Pasuk in Mishlei, God in wisdom created the earth's foundations. In the introduction to this section, we write on page 3, the roots of a tree are its source of life. If you're able to move the pointer, dear Shuli, I'd appreciate it. The roots of a tree are its source of life, allowing the tree to grow and flourish. Without roots, the tree cannot survive. Similarly, spiritual activism has foundations, or yesodot, on which all else is based. The activism to which I aspire recognizes, and this is the foundational idea, that God did not create a perfect world. From this awareness can derive the first foundation of spiritual activism, acknowledging that it is our responsibility to join God in partnership to repair this imperfect, incomplete world. This foundation is why we engage in activism. And in our brief teaching this morning, it's impossible to go into each of the roots, or for that matter, trunks or branches, each of the foundations or pillars or principles. We can only touch upon it. And the foundational root of activism is the idea of covenant. And so let me share this with you. The last word of the creation story is the word la'asot. We say this every Friday night in the Kiddush. Vayvarech Elohim et yom hashvi'i vaykadesh oto kivo Shabbat mikol malachto asher bara Elokim. And God creates the world, and on the seventh day he rested. And then there is sort of like a postscript word which doesn't really fit in, la'asot. La'asot is very similar to the verb which is used in the creation story, which is descriptive of God creating the world, vayas Elohim, vayas, from the root asa. But here, as the last word of creation, it's presented as an imperative, as a mandate. Kivo Shabbat b'kol malachto asher bara Elohim, God rested from all his work. La'asot. La'asot is the imperative. God says, as I have created the world, I've purposely created it incompletely and imperfectly. And I, the creator, ask you, please be a co-creator with me. Join me now in partnership. And together, let's join in to make the world a better world. This is the fundamental idea of Brit, which was not given just to Am Yisrael, to the Jewish people, but it was given to all of humankind. And the way covenant works is that as humankind, or Am Yisrael, as we evolve as years pass, just as a child who grows older is expected to assume more responsibility when born, there is no life that is more vulnerable, more unable to help itself than human life. When animals are born, on some level, they can help themselves, not human life. But we're helped by mother, by father, we're helped by community. But as we grow older, we assume greater responsibility. So too in life, on a national and on a universal level, as the world matures, we are expected by God to assume greater responsibility in that partnership relationship with God. Perhaps the image that most inspired my activism is the image of the St. Louis going back to 1939. It was a German vessel, and it was full of Jews, and it was docked off the Miami harbor, first off Cuba, then it came north. And Jews on board were desperate to disembark so that they can know freedom in America. But the then president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom my grandmother used to call Rosenberg, Roosevelt refused to allow it to dock. And in the end, the ship turned around, and probably 50%, I don't know exactly the number, saw their deaths. People who could have been saved and families that could have been born, they saw their death in the death camps in in Germany and in Poland and in Austria, or who knows, going east, maybe they ran into the Ukraine. And from the time I was a teenager, I would hear people asking, "Who is God? Where was God then?" And the older I become, the more I recognize that that question is unanswerable. But the best I can do with that is to say that as we have a right and responsibility to ask God, "Where are you? Where are you? Where is God?" We should be open to listening to God's question, "And where are you? Are you doing your share?" The question at the Shoah was not only where was God, but where was man? Where was woman? Where were we? I went through most of the files that were available during the time the St. Louis was docked. There was hardly a peep from the Jewish community. I used to walk around with the book written by Arthur Morse, While 6 Million Died. And he writes how the United States ducked chance after chance to save Jews. I knew parts of it by heart, allowing economic considerations and political expediency to outweigh the values of ethics and the values of morality. And as we, again, let me use biblical terminology, have the right and again the responsibility to say, "Echa, God, how could this have happened?" If we vowelize Echa slightly different, it's Ayeka. And where are you? Are we doing our share? It's that little note that I've shared with you. I have on my desk where person one says to person two, "I'm so upset with God. Sometimes I want to ask God, why is there so much poverty? Why is there so much racism? Why is there so much sickness in the world?" And person two says to person one, "Well, why don't you ask God that question?" And person one says, "Because I'm afraid that God is going to ask me the same question." And in my lifetime, I grew up with that clarion call. And I was very influenced. I was influenced by one of my heroes, Glenn Richter, whom I spoke to you about earlier, the late Jacob Birnbaum, Grenenberger, who was the person unknown. You know, when you're the roots, something about the roots of a tree. The tree can't stand without the roots, but you can't see the roots. There's no one more self-effacing than the Glenn Richters of this world. He literally runs from any kavod, any honor. As much, Glenn, as I've really been politicking that you receive an honorary doctorate from YU, you'd probably turn it down if they offered it to you, but I've been trying, Glenn. Yaakov received it, and you should receive it. That is the foundation. That is the roots. Because when one deals with activism, one has to ask, why do we need activism? Why? Why did God create a perfect world? Well, because if the world would be perfect, we wouldn't be human. If it were perfect, we'd have to make correct choices. In fact, there would be no choice because we always have to choose right. There wouldn't be right because they wouldn't be wrong. Right is a relative term. We wouldn't be challenged. There wouldn't be any physicality. Physicality means that at times, whatever we desire is fulfilled. At times, it's not. Being human, and we discussed this at length, that's the way I see the Garden of Eden story. I see the Garden of Eden story as that was the angelic world where there wasn't choice. It was all good. It was good or better, as Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler writes. And the human being didn't sin by eating from the tree, but the consequence of human nature is to reject Eden and to say, I'll embrace the real world, which is our world. In one sentence, the roots of the tree that represents the foundation of activism, asking, why is activism needed today in the world? Because built into the world is imperfection. And activism demands that we do our share in our covenantal relationship with God. And the language we use is to be a co-creator with God. God created the world, but then to join in co-creating, to partner with God to redeem this world, to make this a better world. And with that, from the roots, we move to the trunk of the tree. And I see the trunk of the tree as representing the pillars of activism. And so on page 21, let me read to you the introductory page to this second section of the book, the first dealing with the roots, the foundation, and the second one is dealing with the trunk of the tree, with the principles of the tree. Joseph Albel writes about principles, a term applying to a concept upon which other concepts are entirely dependent, so much so that they cannot exist without the original concept. So let's go to it. And we are now on, I'm sorry, excuse me. We are now, I jumped ahead. We are now on page 21. And this now, excuse me, is the pillars of activism, the pillars of cloud by day and the pillars of fire by night. That's the biblical terminology. Did not waver in front of the people. And here's what we write. Emerging from the roots of a tree is the trunk. The trunk climbs to higher and higher heights as it both grounds the tree to a particular space and provides the necessary support for the continued growth of the branches. The trunk represents the pillars, or amudim, the Hebrew word, of spiritual activism. These pillars represent ascending levels of awareness that an effective and morally grounded activist must attain. And here's what the pillars are about. This is the key, that second paragraph, Shuli. Before people can aspire to leadership, they need a couple of loves. This includes a love for the constituency being served, as well as a passionate belief in the mission being promoted. With respect to the Jewish community, would-be activists need to love the Jewish people, the Torah, okay, the state of Israel, okay, and ultimately all of humankind. Certainly the most basic love, if I want to be a Jewish activist, I have to love the people I'm fighting for. I have to be madly in love, if I'm a Jewish activist, with the Jewish people. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't love humankind. I do. But the love of humankind begins with the love of self. It begins with Ahavat Yisrael. When a leader speaks of having a calling, you often hear clergy say this, but I believe that having a calling is not limited to clergy. It relates to these loves that by and large cannot be taught. They are part of the very essence, the very soul of the spiritual activist, impelling him or her to do on behalf of others. If these loves are missing, then passion will also be absent. Without passion, spiritual activism becomes nothing more than a mundane job. This will show in the quality of one's work, or he or she will not be fully invested in the task at hand. And so in the last 25 years since Chovevei, since Yeshivat Maharat, our mission was to find people who are prepared to contribute leadership in a rabbinic way. And for me, the concept of a rabbi is not to be separate from activism, but activism should be incorporated into the rabbinate. Sometimes I think our bayit has been so developed by, I have no words for Rav Stephen, just the great of the great. But in those days, we would daven and then we would protest. Just being out in the streets and speaking out for Soviet Jewry, speaking out for Israel, speaking out for Holocaust remembrance and Holocaust memories against the white anti-Semites in America like David Duke. I had the great honor to shove a sign into his face when he announced for the presidency, or Pat Buchanan, who was probably the most dangerous of all of them because he was a great writer and very, very smart, or the Farrakhan's of the world, or the Khalid Abdul Mohammeds of the world. And we're looking for rabbis who are not only erudite, but they were ready to stand up. And when I would travel the country trying to recruit young people, especially, would come up to me, and the rabbinate is open to everyone. We've had graduates of all ages. But a young person would come up to me and say, how do I know the rabbinate is for me? And they expect me to say, well, ask yourself this question. Can you learn a Daf Gemara? Can you learn a piece of Talmud? That's not the question that I ask. The question that I ask is the following. Do you love the Jewish people? Do you love all people? But do you have a special love for the Jewish people? If you do, you can become a great rabbi. Anyone, if they put in the time, can learn how to learn, can learn how to give a drasha, a talk, or a class. But the love, there's got to be something in one. There's got to be a calling. Like the first question God asks, Ayeka, Ayeka, where are you? That word we spoke about earlier when we spoke about the trunk of the tree. And we have to be able to respond, Hineni, here I am. That's why I turned around the term for an installation of a rabbi. I'd rather call it not installation, but the Hineniation. And it's not just rabbis who hear the calling. Jews, every Jew can assume leadership. Everyone can assume leadership. Like so many people on this, in this humble class, to assume leadership and respond. And the first, there are, and so the love of Am Yisrael is the trunk, it's the pillar. You have to have that love. Let me say a word about, especially the balance between Jewish love and universal love. A story. Years back, especially when we went to Auschwitz, Glenn was with me, Bernie Glickman and others, Jacob Davidson, Eli Wertman, Moshe Berger. And I was very criticized. We were very criticized. And a dear friend of mine, Rabbi Stephen Franklin, at the Reform Temple was criticizing me during a Yom Kippur service. And at that time, many people from the Reform Temple were coming over to the Bayit, and we were studying together or protesting together. And Stephen and I, we're still close to this day. I'll always feel close to Steve. We decided we would have a dialogue between ourselves. And the dialogue was at the Bayit, was at the synagogue. The sanctuary was then already built, not quite as large as it is now. And each of us had our piece. And there was a man in the back of the room. He raises his hand because I had made the comment that when I look at a list of people in a telephone, in a plane crash, when I see the name Cohen, it moves me more than when I see a non-Jewish name. And he rose and he said to me, Rabbi, I was marching with you, but I can't do it anymore. You're a racist. You're saying you feel for Jews more than you feel for others. Now, the truth of the matter is, in that circumstance, it was basically equal. But I think the point I was making is that I felt a connection. Something really tugged at me when I see a Jewish name. And my response went along these lines. I said, I hear you, but I want to ask you this question. Suppose you're looking at the list and God forbid you see the name of a family member, an inner family member, God forbid a sibling, a close relative. Would you feel that more than you would for even a Jew whom you don't know? It's not human for people to emotionally connect to all people the same. The way of the world is that we feel a closer attachment to Am Yisrael. We feel, as I feel close to Toby in ways I feel close to no one else, or to my children, or grandchildren, or my parents of blessed memory, or my siblings. I feel the special connection to them, like concentric circles. That's the inner circle, the circle with a larger radii going around that inner circle is the circle of my people. It's Am Yisrael. And then there is the larger circle of humankind. And in my days, and I think to this day, I take second place to no one when it comes to our concern for humankind. Someone just sent me a video of a talk that I gave at a local mosque after the New Zealand mosque was attacked. And we stayed throughout the service, and then the imam invited me, and I came forward. And this wasn't a pretend, this wasn't a show, and I'm not telling you this to impress. This is what we're about. And gave a little talk, and we sang Shlomo's for the Manachai Virei, or going down to the AME church after 9 Black brothers and sisters were murdered there, going back to 2015. Or you remember when we walked out of the shul to St. Gabe's after there was an attack against the Catholic community. It goes on and on and on. Because, and this is the key, if the trunk is love, the deepest love is Ahavat Yisrael, the love of the Jewish people. But this sentence is a key sentence in my spiritual activism. The loving of the Jewish people does not contradict our love on a universal level, but is the prerequisite to it. A strong sense of particularistic, or let me speak normal words, a strong sense of who we are, a strong sense of our national consciousness, of our consciousness to ourselves as Jews, does not contradict our universal responsibilities, but is a prerequisite to it. That's why when Abraham is tapped, he's not tapped just to be the father of Avram, he becomes Avraham, Avhamon Goyim. He's the father of the world. He's the father like Sarai. Originally, Sarai means my princess, and she becomes Sarah. Sarah means the princess of all. She has something to teach all of humankind. And so the narrow straits don't contradict the larger horizons. It's the gateway, it's the pathway. And this is the way I wrote about it in this section of the book on page 24 towards the bottom. Here's what we wrote. I am always concerned when people say, you know, Rabbi, I love everyone. I invariably respond, fine, you love everyone, but tell me, how do you love your father, your mother, your child? It is easy to love everyone. It is far more difficult to love someone. This is because when you love all people, you don't have to love any particular person. The true test of how you love everyone is the way you love someone. Similarly, how a person loves all people is measured by the way that person loves his or her own people. An enlightened sense of national identity, rather than being a contradiction to universal consciousness, is in fact a prerequisite for it. It is not uncommon to find that great nationalists are also great universalists. Natan Sharansky, who fearlessly fought for Jewish rights in the former Soviet Union, was a founder of the Helsinki Watch Committee, which monitored the human rights conditions of all people living in the former Soviet Union. And Sharansky, which I think should be a verb to Sharansky, because he really is a leader of leaders, there was a while when the Israeli government did not identify with Sharansky. They thought that his Zionism, his nationalism was tainted because he was a universalist. He was the spokesperson for Sakharov, for universal freedom and rights, all kinds of freedom. They didn't understand Natan's message. Sure, I'm a Jew, and that's his priority. He's devoted his life to the Jewish people, but he's written, if I'm only a Jew and that's all I care about, that's fascism. But if I care about everyone, that's a democracy where the love becomes like soft. It becomes like something that you can go. It's not dense. It's not heavy. And then I conclude. I am often asked, and please that I use the I try never to use the I. So this is meant just to make a point and nothing else. No one knows better than I how little I've done and how much more I hope God will give me the ability to do. I am often asked why I do what I do. Why run to Istanbul or Buenos Aires after terrorist attacks? Why travel to Oslo when Palestinian Authority leader and terrorist Yasser Arafat received the Nobel Peace Prize? Why go here? Why go there? It is because I love my people. That love is the basis of my activism. My people is my family, just as I love my inner family unconditionally, and I react to their pain as if it were mine, so too do I love my larger family, Am Yisrael. For me, the question is not, why go to the end of the world to help another Jew, but rather, how can one not go to the end of the world to help another Jew? And so we move to the third stage, Tu B'Shvat, Holiday of Trees, the tree that is seen as the diagram, as seen as the motto in Jewish philosophy by the Albo in exegesis. It's the motto, the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, of the Sfirot, is also the model of spiritual activism. Just to summarize, the roots, that's the foundation. Without that foundation, it all falls. And the foundation deals with the fundamental questions. Why do we need this in the first place? And then the trunk. The trunk deals with the pillars, that before I can even get involved, I need a couple of loves. And the most basic love is, if you're involved in Dr. Martin Luther King's cause, you have to passionately be involved and feel the pain of the discrimination of your Black brothers and sisters. Now, that doesn't mean that one should not go beyond one's cause. King famously spoke out for a Soviet Jewry all the way back in 1964, something that we mentioned in the memoir on Soviet Jewry, the book dedicated to Dear Glenn. So too, love of Israel. The love of the Jewish people should not conflict with our universal responsibilities, but is the prerequisite to it. As Hillel said famously, he writes, "Uchsha'ani la'atzmi mo'ani," if I'm only for myself, what is worth? But that's preceded by the dictum, "Im ein ani li." If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Uchsha'ani la'atzmi, but if I'm only for myself, mo'ani, what is my worth? And then he says, "Ve'im lo achshav," and if not now, when? We all have a way of putting things off, but putting things off, we may put it off forever. When is the time to do? The time to do is now, not wait for tomorrow. And from the trunks, the trunk of the tree moves into the branches. And so I start with this third section with the following on page 49. The trunk of the tree then branches out in all different directions. These limbs represent the principles or ikarim of spiritual activism. They help to guide a leader in the pursuit of spiritual activism. Each limb reaches up and out, seeking its own way. At the same time, the limbs sometimes interweave, forming unique configurations. They produce other branches that yield leaves and fruits. Limbs and branches sway and bend, responding to the force and direction of the wind. From the top of the tree, a greater, more encompassing view of the surrounding scene unfolds. Like the branches of the tree, the principles of spiritual activism frequently interweave, but each principle also serves a unique purpose. And this is the key sentence. The principle involves choosing a cause. Now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. Okay, I understand why I have to be involved. Okay, I feel the love for my people. But how do I choose a cause? Partnership. Who do I partner with? Strategy. What is the strategy? In that section, for example, on strategy, I talk about why I'm unalterably opposed in the spirit of King to violence as a means of social action. We've been in situations, even when hit, we never ever would respond. Understanding the human sensibilities. Activism could make you very, very harsh. It's interesting that in activism, we're trying to help another person. But in the process of helping other people, if people get in the way, as much as we want to help people, not only do we not help these people, we step on them. Or to use the Buberian terminology, sometimes in caring for the other as a thou, we step on others as it's. I remember on a hunger strike, this goes back to 1982, sitting in front of or diagonally across the street, that's where we were allowed to sit from the Soviet mission. So the Soviets, they used to have the KGB on the rooftop of that big building. It's still there on 67th Street between Lexington and Park. And we could see the figures at the top of the roof. And the Chevre used to scream, Ruski, if I could face everyone, Shuli, Ruski, Ruski, jump, jump. And I would say to myself, really? Is that what I want? Do I want that man, even though it's not my friend, maybe my enemy? Do I want them to jump right now, to be sprawled on the floor? Or when you speak to a reporter, and this is now part of the strategy was always to stand up for a principle. And it was not for PR. It was to do what we did because it was the right thing to do. Now, of course, we invited PR. We always would want to spread the message. But even if there would be no camera, we would have done it. Hubert Humphrey used to say that when you're out there, always speak to the cameras. I don't agree with that. I don't think so. I think we speak, first of all, we speak to be true to ourselves. And we speak because it's true for the cause. And because it'll bring pressure. Of course, to bring pressure, let's say on the Soviets, you do need help from newspapers and the electronic media, and today the internet and all of that stuff. But human sensibilities, in working on a book now that I hope will come out soon. It's called Defending Holocaust Memory. And I apologize in the book. It's not that I believe that some of the positions we took were wrong, but we took no prisoners. We were very, very tough. And we were very tough on fellow and sister Jews. Often I thought they were making no contribution. But as I get older, I recognize everybody was making a contribution. We were a symphony. We were an orchestra. And because they were in the establishment doesn't make them bad. They too contributed in their own way. And then part of the principles are, what's the price you pay for activism? Pay a big price, especially a family price. That's what I write about. Big, big family price. I remember back in the early 90s, after Rabbi Kahana was murdered, so I was on a death threat list. And at one point, I was able to convince the police that I didn't need any more shmirah. I didn't need any guard. And the police left, and we walked out, and we saw in front of the old house on 4055, there was something bulbous. And Toby said, don't touch it, but I did. As it turned out, it was not a real grenade, but it was a grenade. It looked like a grenade. And on the inside, it said, Kahana is dead. You're next. And at that time, Ilana was getting married to Michael. They're living in Israel now with 9 children and grandchildren, and they're army people and all that. She walks into the house, and high brass police, 20, 30 police were there. And Ilana sits down, and she looks at me, and she says, Abba, I love you, but I can't wait to get married. I can't wait to get out of here. You pay a price. So these causes, basically, and actually it was Rabbi Saul Berman who saw all the principles, and he's an absolute genius. So he took the principles and he divided them as only he can do into different categories. So the principles were choosing a cause, with whom do you partner, the strategizing, understanding human sensibilities, and the price you pay in the bigger picture for activism. But if I had to choose one principle of activism, it would be stand up for a cause, not because it's necessarily popular, but because it's the right thing to do. That's a very, very important principle. Become involved in the cause. Don't make assessments and be sure you can win. No, the real test of a spiritual activism is getting involved even when you're not so sure you're going to win. Of course, deep down, you've got to believe and have the confidence with God's help it'll all work out. But you've got to be involved because it's the right thing to do. It's the proper thing to do. And that really has been a cornerstone of Bayit, of student struggle for Soviet Jewry, of Amcha activism to this day. And the truth of the matter is, when you ask gurus of leadership, what is leadership? They'll tell you that leadership is change. That's the definition. Leadership is change, but people resist change. People resist change. So it's often those who are the first to speak out. They are rejected by the mainstream. The mainstream is too bureaucratic to be the ones to initiate the change. Change doesn't come from within. I don't think there's a movement that started from within, from the Jewish people. Abraham, and Sarah, they weren't from within. They were lone figures talking about monotheism. Lone figures. That's why Abraham is called Ivri. He was the Hebrew. He was the loner. The rabbis say everybody was on one side of the river and Abraham was on the other. Or Moshe and Aaron. When they come to the palace of the king, the rabbis ask, and where was the rest of the people? Well, they dropped off one by one. Think about the Soviet Jewry movement. It started as a movement from the outside. The mainstream pushed back. You can't protest against the Soviet Union. You can't protest against Nixon and the White House demanding that they do more. That's not what Nixon wants. He wants détente. You're going to upset him. Or even Zionism. Theodor Herzl was not a very popular figure. There were people who pushed back. Or the civil rights movement. Our Black brothers and sisters, even the clergy down there, told Dr. Martin Luther King, you're a troublemaker. You're a troublemaker. Go home. And that's why the Soviet Jewry movement, the Ethiopian Jewry movement, Zionism, to talk about our classic movements, it begins on the outside and it's resisted. But of course, the goal of the activist is to bring the larger community in. It gets a little complicated because once the larger community recognizes that the cause is the right cause and they have to get involved, they often try to undercut those who were there in the first place. And so it gets a little delicate. But if I were to choose one principle, which is the most important branch of it all, it's that principle. And I want to thank my father. It was my father really who stood up for causes. This was his MO, not because they were popular, but because they were right. And so there you have it. It's a story of Tu B'Shvat that can be understood in so many different ways. We've tried to deal with Tu B'Shvat over the years in a multi-layered way. And then here we are talking about something so close to our hearts, standing up for Am Yisrael, standing up with pride, with hadar, unflinching, standing strong, and seeing that spiritual activism is not just shouting and going home and gamarnu. No, spiritual activism is complex. That's why it's called spiritual activism, because the activism is inspired by something spiritual, by a calling within ourselves. Because the activism is meant, even if we're physically defending the Jewish people, standing up in defense of the Jewish people, ultimately, it has to turn into something more proactive. Spirituality is proactive. Standing up is more reactive, although reactive can also be a form of spirituality. God bless those who woke up as Jews after October 7th. They got to take it to the next level, turn that reaction into a proactive element, but they deserve great credit and should be blessed. And so it moves from the trunks, to summarize, from the roots, the covenant, why, to the trunk. You need a couple of loves before you can really be an activist. You got to love your people like mad, love your family like mad. And then the branches, the cause. What's the strategy? Who are my partners? What's the price I pay for the activism? I'm going to stop here. And I spoke much too long, but we have a few moments to open this up. And if anyone has any thoughts. Yes.
Do you have time to tell the story that when you persuaded your board at the Hebrew Institute to allow you to open the basement to people who were not members, to have an open Rosh Hashanah service? And you taught them this nigun.
Let me hear it. You remember the story better than I do.
You taught them this, so you thought you might have just a few people attend, and it turned out you had hundreds, 200, and you taught them, since they were from all walks of life, and there was not a lot of that you could go over with them. So you taught them a nigun. Da 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 da. Do you remember that nigun?
Oh yeah, sure.
And then later on,
yeah, but then
so then it was a few days later, and you were going into the city, and you just missed the bus.
Oh yeah,
And do you remember that story?
you tell me.
All right, so the bus went 100 yards or so and stopped. And so he was running, and he stopped, and you got into the bus, and you were panting, and you asked the bus driver, "This is a great nace gadol, that you would stop for someone, a bus in New York." So you asked him why. Why did the bus driver stop? And he said, da, 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 da. Remember that?
Right? Yankel, the bus driver.
That's right. That's right.
It's a Rebbe's story that you should remember.
That's amazing.
And that's spiritual activism too. Spiritual activism, it's not only standing in the streets and getting busted. That's not, no, spiritual activism is whatever one is doing for an other. That is spiritual activism. For oneself too, but for someone else. So the people who come to the bayit and they're knitting caps for the soldiers in the army, that's spiritual activism. It's all good. It's all good as long as I can, after a day's work, here I'm talking to myself, lecturing myself to do more. But as long as I devoted part of the day to others, somehow. So Shuli, if you can just
Yeah, so I see Tova's hand and I see Lance's hand. Does anyone else have a hand up? Not right now. So let's go Tova and Lance.
Okay. Rav Avi, first I have to disagree with you. I think God did make a perfect world, because you cannot have perfection if you don't have the good and the other side of the coin. And if there were no
Oh,
bad, like if there was no death, there could be no life.
beautiful.
And if there were no
Tova, that's so beautiful what you're saying. What you're saying is it's precisely because there's choice and there's good and bad. That's what makes it a perfect world. It's a
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful framing, Tova. I always, every time you say something, it's very moving.
if
It's
there were
beautiful.
no if there were no bad, if there were no evil, there would be no reason for spiritual
Yeah,
activism.
yeah. Look, it's a little hard, because there's so much sickness in the world, and it's a little hard to say that part. But it's a beautiful framing. It's a very creative, beautiful framing. I cut you off, please, Tova. I was so
Go.
excited by what you said.
No, I think Lance wanted you to say something.
Okay. Rav Avi, I want to take everything you have said today and put it into one sentence. Logically, then, the human to God and human to human laws do not stand independently, but rather intersect, complementing and ennobling each other.
Yes.
Where does that come from?
I first of all, I think that is very well said. And just as an aside, there is a rabbinic teaching in the Mechilta when we look at the 10 commandments, which we read last week, the 10 declarations. So normally when one looks at it, one divides the 10 commandments vertically, the first 5 being human to God and the last 5 human to human. There is a very creative idea that the commandments should not be divided vertically, but horizontally. So try to understand what is the relationship between the first and the sixth, the second and the seventh, the third and the eighth, the fourth and the ninth, the fifth and the 10th. Now, the first is, I am the Lord your God. And the sixth is, thou shalt not murder. And there is a very, very powerful teaching. And that is, if God forbid somebody takes the life of another, they also have cut into God's essence. Every human being is created in the image of God. And so when I take the life of another, I've taken part of God as God was functioning in this human being in this world. So a sin against a human being is a sin against God. And I'd also like to understand it in the reverse, that a sin against God, that God's commandments are meant to make life more meaningful, more beautiful. So that can also turn into it could conflate with Bein Adam L'Chaviro, but that is for another time. But Lance, again, you do have I always have said that to our students, and thank God, many of them grow to be way beyond me. I heard Rabbi Chaim Martyr speak the other day at the wedding of his son, and I just, he's been in the rabbinate a long time, but he's so beyond whatever I can dream of. But I always tell students that when they finish giving a practice sermon, I would say, can you summarize it in one sentence? Got to be able. So you're the Rebbe of doing that, Lance, week after week.
Rav Avi, I must tell you this. This line, together with what you just said, comes from an essay that you wrote in Love Torah called Respect for Both God and People. I read your essays week by week on the Parsha to come. I was reading your essays on Mishpatim, and I discovered this one yesterday in a class with Bert Nussbacher on Chavura. we studied Bain Adam Lachavero. But what you did, you took Bain Adam LaMakom as well as Bain Adam LaChavero, put them together. What you have done is to intertwine human beings with God.
Right. Thank you, Lance. Estelle?
I sort of have a funny feeling. After all, we know that human beings developed. God did not enter into just, quote, establishing the human being. So that when human beings developed, they developed good and bad and in between and all kinds. Maybe that's where God comes in and says, well, the good people, like your spiritual activism, should be this way to destroy or to overcome the bad elements. I mean, this was a natural development. We're attributing all of this to God when it really isn't so.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank
You're
you.
not answering me on that.
No, because I think it stands on its own, Estelle. I appreciate that. I would always try to answer, but you have more answers than I do. It just was said very well. So I thank you. I thank you very much. Yeah. Anyone else?
Oh, can I answer one more thing? I have a friend who was on the St. Louis, and she's a good friend, and we've talked together over the years. If you'd like, I could ask her. Maybe she could give a lecture at HIR if you're willing on this. She lives nearby.
That sounds wow. I would love to meet her. I don't know how if her memories are vivid, but I would love that if I could. I wanted to end just to ask Ruby. Ruby, there's a story about Stanley. Talk about spiritual activism. Stanley went to which high school? To Clinton. And there's a beautiful story about Stanley, who was the president of the class. Do you remember the story? I'm sure he shared it with you, about how they were insisting that Black students come through the back. Do you remember something like that? I was wondering if you could share it. As I remember it, that they were saying that at their graduation, I don't remember it precisely, they were discriminating against Black students, and they said the Black students would have to come through the back entrance, not through the front. And Stanley, this is now going back to the 40s, I imagine, right? He said, we're not marching in graduation unless we can all march in together. Am I close to being right, Ruby?
I think so.
It's actually been written up, and I've seen it in books. And to me, that's everyone. Spiritual activism is not just for the other person. It's for all of us. And I'm humbled I see it at the Bayit. You follow Ann Lappin and James. They're always walking around with a little child, and they had a little child they were walking around with. That's the 50th foster care child they're taking care of. I mean, it's like, wow. It's I see it. I see it in just looking at your faces. Everyone has done their share. Leza, as usual, you have the last word. If Leza's on.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought what you said today was terrific. The thing that struck me was when you were talking, Lance, about the 10 declarations. There's a story about that. The late comedian George Carlin once tried a routine where he could telescope all 10 into one commandment. And it bombed. It was terrible. He took it out. It wasn't funny at all. But it gave me an idea. I said, what if you would try and do that? Could it be possible? And I said, the eighth commandment, lo tignov, might fit, because what does that mean if you look at it in a broad sense? Who says lo? Well, that covers the first two commandments. And tignov, thou shalt not steal, but supposing you steal a life, that's murder. Supposing you steal property, supposing you steal, it goes on and on. Every sin can be seen as a form of theft.
Interesting.
And it struck me as it's what you don't do. And in order not to do really, I thought the basic love is an infant for its mother.
Right. Beautifully said.
And that is what extends all the love you're talking about.
Yeah.
You have to deal with that, which is not easy to deal with.
Right.
But I think
Thank
that's
you.
where you have to.
Thank you, Lisa. Karen, what do you remember about your days?
Well, you had a great, I was 21 when I moved to Riverdale, and a product of Ramaz. And
Oh, wow.
so I marched for Soviet Jewry. I graduated Ramaz in 1970, but you were an icon then, and you and Yitz Greenberg, without
Of
myself
course.
getting emotional, you had a tremendous impact on my life. And now that I'm in my 70s and retired, I really think back to those days in activism and with everything going on in the world right now. And I think back to my role models, and you were one of them, and Rabbi Haskell Lookstein. And I have pictures of myself marching for Soviet Jewry.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
But they were really 2.5 solid years in Riverdale.
Right.
When I was so young. And, I still consider it my formative years, so, but I will never forget you and your image in Riverdale. That was way back now for you as well.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So you impacted our lives, and I think a lot of who we are of course from our parents, but
of course
you're in that group as well, along with Rabbi Lookstein and Yitz Greenberg.
He was look, Haskell.
Yeah.
He is really extraordinary.
I'm still in contact with him.
He's extraordinary what he did.
Extraordinary what he did. What I always tell him that I am so proud when I say I'm a Ramaz graduate. Yeah.
You should be. And my relationship with Haskell has really evolved. I wrote a piece when he was honored for, he worked within the establishment, but I came to understand he was a hero.
A hero.
It's easy when you're outside of the establishment to say whatever you want.
And my great bracha is my son lives in Hollywood, Florida, and so does Haskell, Rabbi Lookstein. Right. So I get to see him. And
by the way, one of the principles of activism is never forget how to laugh. It's actually funny sometimes.
Well, I'm going to write that down. That's very good.
Well, I'll tell you what Haskell once said to me. I said to him a couple of years ago, I said, Haskell, you're in your 90s. Do you still daven Ne'ilah? Ne'ilah is the final service on Yom Kippur. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, generally, the new rabbi, Rabbi Steinmetz, he should be the one who's the cantor, who's davening Ne'ilah. You shouldn't be davening. He says, oh, no. anyone who tried to try out for my position, we made sure that he couldn't carry a tune. That's Haskell. He
And also, what he said to us over and over again,
mm,
be a mensch,
yeah,
be a mensch. If we can produce students that are all mensches, then we've really
yeah,
succeeded.
no, he's a great man. He
Great
sure is.
man,
And
great
so is
man.
Yitz, Yitz,
It's,
Shlomo Riskin. They were in all this way before I was. And Glenn,
I,
last word, Glenn Richter. Are you on? Glenn? He probably got bored.
yeah,
Glenn Aled, you don't want to. Glenn. All right. Okay. Just it's good to see everyone. And
stay well,
next
stay
week, next
strong.
Tuesday, and then I'm on my way to Israel 2 weeks from today. So we'll see what happens. Just all my blessings and love. Arnie, I didn't hear from you. Say hello. Right.
You're muted, Arnie, but hi. You got it.
So I remember marching with my father in the Soviet Jewry parade demonstrations, and he would always say there should be 1,000 Avi Weisses for the
Yeah.
Jewish people.
Yeah. And there should be 10,000 Arnie Kramers. For sure. And,
yeah.
And I want you to know, I'll end with this, that we always wondered, would there ever be a renewed Soviet Jewry movement? That is to say, that was a time when everyone was involved. Karen was talking about Ramah students from everywhere being involved. And what would be the rallying call to bring everyone together? And I'm seeing that now. October 7th was dark, but I'm seeing, by and large, Jews and young people. I know that there's been a lot about, the encampments and Jews, but the vast, vast, vast majority of Jews, they've stood up. Yesterday, there's a weekly rally here at the monument. It was pouring. And of course, Rev Stephen is there, and they're speaking out for the hostages. And so they asked me to say a few words. It's pouring, that's not the time to be long-winded. So this was my speech. I think it's the shortest speech I ever gave. I just looked at them and I said, just looking at all of you, all I can say, as it was coming down buckets then, I said, God bless you. We're in good hands. And that's what I felt. We're in good hands, and we have a lot to be proud of. Israel is going to be strong, and Israel is going to overcome. It's just an honor, even in the midst of all of the pain that we're feeling. It's a remarkable time. So all my blessings and love to all of you. Take care, everyone. Shalom.